The night the truth was buried, the city lights seemed to burn colder than ever. Behind the tinted windows of a luxury car, a powerful politician thought his secrets were safe. His money, his influence, his name had silenced victims before. But this time, he chose the wrong person to intimidate. The young woman he tried to silence didn't have power, or wealth, or connections. What she had was courage, and a brotherhood that didn't answer to fear. When the Hells Angels heard her story, something inside them snapped. They didn't call the police. They didn't post online. They started their engines. In a world where justice could be bought, these men were the price money couldn't pay. They'd been called outlaws, rebels, even criminals. But that night, there was something else entirely. The storm that comes for the untouchable. The politician had laughed at the law, used it as a weapon. But he had no idea what it meant to face men who lived by a different code. One written in loyalty, blood, and respect. When the angels ride, it's not for glory. It's for balance. And this time, balance demanded a reckoning. It began quietly. The woman's voice trembled as she told her story to one of the bikers, a scarred man named Jax, who'd seen too much of life to be shocked, but never enough to stop feeling. He listened, his jaw tightening with every word, the flame of rage lighting behind his calm eyes. When she finished, he stood up and said just 6 words, "No one does this," and walks away. Within hours, engines thundered across the city like an omen. The streets that once belonged to power now belonged to justice on 2 wheels. The politician, confident in his control, never saw it coming. The night he thought he was untouchable became the night he faced his truth. The angels didn't need cameras or headlines. They needed him to see what fear looked like when it wore his own reflection. They weren't the law, but they were the line. And once you crossed it, there was no going back. What happened that night would never make the news, but it would echo in whispers for years to come. Because sometimes, justice doesn't wear a suit or carry a badge. Sometimes, it rides leather and steel, fueled by the simple belief that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, has the right to silence the innocent. And when the Hells Angels ride for the truth, not even the devil himself stands in their way. The night the Hells Angels decided to intervene, the air felt heavier, charged with the kind of silence that only comes before a storm. Jax stood beneath the neon glow of the garage, a cigarette burning low between his fingers, the ember flickering like the anger in his chest. He had seen corruption before, judges bought, cops paid, truth buried. But this was different. This wasn't business. This was personal. The woman's trembling voice still echoed in his mind, the way her hands shook when she spoke about what the politician had done. She hadn't come to them for revenge. She came because she had nowhere else to go. And that, to the angels, meant one thing. Someone had to pay. Around him, the crew gathered. Men who looked rough on the outside but carried their own kind of morality inside. Ghost, their road captain, leaned against his bike, eyes narrowing as he listened to Jax. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. Jax nodded without hesitation. He used power to hurt her. We use ours to make it right. The others exchanged glances. They didn't need laws to decide what was just. They lived by a creed that ran deeper than words. Protect the innocent, punish the corrupt, ride together, die together. And tonight, that creed would roar through the streets like thunder. The plan wasn't chaos. It was precision. They didn't rush in guns blazing. They gathered information, followed trails, mapped patterns. The politician, a man named Grant Holloway, was a master manipulator. He'd built his empire on intimidation, silencing anyone who dared to speak against him. But he had one weakness, his arrogance. He believed no one would ever dare to confront him, let alone a group of men society called outlaws. What he didn't understand was that outlaws don't ask for permission. They take back what the system refuses to defend. Over the next few nights, the angels watched him. They saw the way he smiled on television, pretending to care about the people he secretly exploited. They saw him enter his mansion late at night, guarded by men with suits and cold eyes. But Jax wasn't watching his wealth. He was watching his patterns, his fear, the cracks in the mask that only men like him could spot. "Everyone bleeds," Jax said one evening as they prepared to move. "Even those who think they're untouchable." The crew nodded, silent but ready. When the time came, it wasn't revenge that drove them. It was justice, the kind the world had forgotten. As their engines roared to life, echoing across the sleeping city, Jax felt something stir deep in his chest. He wasn't just riding for her anymore. He was riding for every voice that had been silenced, every truth that had been buried beneath power and lies. And as the night swallowed them whole, the line between sinners and saviors blurred into the sound of engines and vengeance. Grant Holloway sat in his penthouse office, sipping aged whiskey as the city glittered beneath him. To him, the world was a chessboard, and he was the player, not the piece. He had crushed reporters, bribed officials, destroyed reputations, all without breaking a sweat. That's why when his assistant mentioned a rumor spreading among bikers, he laughed. "Let them bark," he said smugly. "Dogs don't bite the hand that feeds the cops." But what Holloway didn't realize was that these weren't dogs. They were wolves. And wolves don't bark. They hunt. While Holloway reveled in his illusion of control, the angels were already inside his world. Ghost hacked into his security cameras. Tank followed his guards. And Jax made contact with one of his former employees, a man too afraid to testify, but too guilty to stay silent. Piece by piece, they uncovered the rot beneath Holloway's empire. Fake charities, blackmail, trafficking, and bribes that reached higher than anyone dared to imagine. The deeper they dug, the darker it got. But Jax wasn't shaken. He'd seen darkness before. What fueled him was the thought of the woman who still woke up shaking every night, waiting for justice that never came. The angels didn't just want to expose Holloway. They wanted him to feel what he'd made others feel. Fear, isolation, powerlessness. And that kind of lesson couldn't be taught in courtrooms. It had to be taught in silence and shadows. So, they started small. A convoy of bikes surrounded his limousine one night on his way home, headlights glaring through the tinted glass. They didn't touch him. They didn't speak. They just stared, their presence louder than any threat. Then they vanished into the dark, leaving him with only the sound of his heartbeat and the echo of his guilt. The next night, they left a message outside his mansion. A single white envelope, no signature, just a photograph of the woman he had hurt, and beneath it, the words, "We see you." Holloway's arrogance began to crack. He doubled his security, but fear doesn't care about walls or guards. It eats from the inside, one sleepless night at a time. His whiskey no longer burned with pride, it burned with panic. The man who once silenced others now lived in silence himself, afraid to even step into the light. Jax watched from afar, his face unreadable. "Let him drown in the same fear he gave her," he said quietly. "Then we'll finish what we started." The others agreed, but Cole, older, wiser, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Be careful, brother. When you stare too long into the fire, it starts to recognize you." Jax looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "I know," he said, "but some fires need to burn before the world remembers what truth looks like." And with that, the angels disappeared once more into the night, ghosts of justice riding toward the reckoning that was yet to come. The days that followed were a slow, psychological descent for Grant Holloway. Every corner he turned seemed to hide a shadow. Every sound of an engine made his heart pound like gunfire. The man who once controlled judges and police now couldn't even control his own fear. His assistants noticed his paranoia, but no one dared to speak of it. He screamed at his driver for taking the wrong route, accused his security of betrayal, and fired 2 men in a single day. The walls of power that once protected him had become a cage, and the cracks were spreading fast. That's what the Hells Angels wanted. Not his death, but his unraveling. Jax watched it happen from a distance, his expression caught between satisfaction and sorrow. He had seen men break before, but never one so proud, so sure of his own invincibility. "The mighty fall hardest," Ghost muttered one night, watching the news coverage of Holloway's sudden withdrawal from public appearances. "Yeah," Jax said softly, "but some need to hit the ground to remember they're human." The words carried weight, not just for Holloway, but for everyone who'd ever been crushed by someone like him. The angels weren't out for revenge. They were out for balance, the kind of justice the world had forgotten how to deliver. But even justice carried consequences. The angels' presence had not gone unnoticed. Whispers spread among law enforcement about a biker gang terrorizing a politician. Reporters sniffed around, desperate for a headline. Jax knew it was only a matter of time before the wrong kind of attention turned their mission into a manhunt. Still, he couldn't stop now. Not when Holloway was finally facing what he had forced others to endure. "We end it soon," Cole warned, "before this turns into something we can't control." Jax nodded, but his eyes told another story. For him, this wasn't just about one man. It was about a world where money bought silence and fear ruled truth. That night, Holloway received another message, hand-delivered by someone who vanished before the guards could react. Inside was a single photograph, his face on the front page of a fake newspaper, headline reading "The Fallen King." Beneath it, a note scrawled in red ink. "The people you silenced have found their voice." Holloway's hand shook as he read it. His empire of lies, built brick by brick on manipulation, was collapsing around him. He called the police, but even they were hesitant now. No one wanted to protect a man whose sins were being dragged into the light. Meanwhile, Jack stood on the rooftop of an abandoned warehouse overlooking the city, the wind whipping through his jacket. He lit another cigarette and whispered, "He's cracking." Ghost leaned beside him, smirking. "Good. Let him feel small." Jax exhaled slowly, the smoke curling into the night. "He already is," he said. "He just doesn't know it yet." The engines of justice were still idling, waiting for the final ride, the one that would strip Holloway of the last thing he clung to, his image. The final act began on a stormy Friday night. The rain came down in sheets, washing the city in silver streaks as thunder rolled over the skyline. Holloway sat alone in his mansion, curtains drawn, every light blazing as if brightness could keep his demons away. He hadn't slept in days. His mind replayed the woman's voice, the same voice he had silenced, the same truth he had buried. Now it haunted him like a ghost that refused to die. He poured another drink, hands trembling, when a sudden sound froze him. The deep, unmistakable growl of motorcycles approaching through the storm. Outside, the Hells Angels rode through the rain like phantoms carved from steel and thunder. Headlights cut through the darkness, reflecting off the wet pavement like fire on water. Jax led the formation, his face hidden behind his visor, his heart pounding with purpose. They weren't coming to kill a man. They were coming to bury a monster's illusion. When they reached the gates, the guards stepped forward nervously, weapons drawn. But Cole raised his hand, signaling peace. "We're not here for blood," he shouted through the rain. "We're here for truth." And before the guards could respond, the gates opened, not by command, but by fear. The angels rode in, surrounding the mansion like a circle of judgment. Jax dismounted, rain pouring down his face as he approached the door. It opened slowly, revealing Holloway, pale, shaken, hollow-eyed. "What do you want?" he croaked, voice trembling. Jack stepped closer, his boots echoing against the marble floor. "The truth," he said simply. "You try to bury it. Now it's time to dig it up." He tossed a flash drive onto the table. Every secret, every crime, every piece of evidence they had gathered. "You have one night to confess before the world does it for you." Holloway stared at it, his breathing ragged. "You think you're heroes?" he spat. Jax tilted his head slightly. "No," he said, "with a reminder that men like you still bleed." And with that, he turned and walked away, the sound of his boots fading beneath the thunder. The angels mounted their bikes, engines rumbling like growling beasts, and rode off into the storm. Behind them, the mansion stood trembling, not from the weather, but from the truth waiting to explode. By dawn, the city woke to chaos. Every news channel, every social feed, every headline carried the same story: Grant Holloway exposed. The flash drive had found its way to the world, and the empire that once silenced others had been silenced itself. For the Hells Angels, it wasn't victory, it was balance restored. As Jax watched the sunrise from the open highway, rain still dripping from his gloves, he muttered under his breath, "Justice doesn't need applause. It just needs to be done." And the roar of engines answered him, carrying the truth into the horizon. The fallout was immediate and merciless. Grant Holloway's name was everywhere, on the news, in headlines, whispered through boardrooms and back alleys. The once untouchable man was now a symbol of corruption's decay. His empire of lies crumbled overnight. Politicians who once stood beside him turned their backs. His wealth couldn't buy silence anymore, not when the truth had been unleashed for the world to see. Reporters camped outside his mansion. Protesters carried signs with the same words the angels had written. "We see you." For the first time, Holloway faced what his victims had faced: exposure, fear, shame. The difference was, he deserved it. In the garage, Jax watched the television from the corner, the images flashing across his face. Ghost leaned on his bike, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. "We did it," he said. But Jax didn't smile. He simply said, "She did it. We just gave her voice back." He wasn't interested in fame or credit. He knew justice wasn't about headlines. It was about giving power back to those who'd been robbed of it. Still, part of him couldn't shake the darkness that lingered. You don't drag a monster into the light without getting burned. And as the cameras tore Holloway apart, Jax wondered if he'd lost a piece of himself in the process. Days passed, and the city began to shift. The woman they defended finally stepped forward publicly. Her name was Emily Warren. Her voice shook during the interview, but her words were unbreakable. "No one should have to be afraid to tell the truth," she said. And sometimes, the truth needs a little help getting out. Behind the cameras, Jack stood in the crowd, hidden beneath his leather jacket and dark sunglasses. When she looked toward him, their eyes met for just a moment, enough to say everything that needed to be said. Gratitude, strength, closure. That night, the angels gathered by the fire at the edge of town. Rain had stopped, leaving the earth smelling of smoke and steel. Tank cracked open a bottle, raising it toward the sky. "To the ones who can't speak for themselves," he said, "and to the ones who never stop fighting for them." The crew echoed his words, their voices blending with the crackling fire and the low hum of distant thunder. Jack stayed silent, staring into the flames. He knew what they'd done mattered, but he also knew the world was full of men like Holloway, and their fight would never really end. Cole noticed his silence. "You can't save them all, brother," he said softly. Jax nodded. "I know," he replied, "but I can make sure the ones who hurt them don't sleep easy." Cole smiled faintly. "That's enough." The fire reflected in their eyes, glowing like the engines that carried their cause. They weren't saints. They weren't heroes. But in a world that often turned away, they were the ones who refused to look the other way. And that was enough to keep them riding. Weeks turned into months, and the story of the Hells Angels and the fallen politician became legend. Half truth, half whisper, all warning. In bars and garages, men spoke of them with a mix of fear and respect. No one knew their names, but everyone knew their message. You can't silence the truth forever. For the angels, it wasn't glory they wanted. It was deterrence. Each rumor that spread about them was another shield for someone who couldn't fight back. And though their world remained hidden in smoke and secrecy, their actions had begun to leave ripples far beyond the roar of their engines. Emily's life began to heal. She moved away, started volunteering for victims of abuse and corruption, using her story to give strength to others. Every time she spoke, her words carried the echo of the men who'd helped her find her voice again. She didn't glorify them. She didn't need to. She simply said, "They reminded me that justice doesn't need permission." That line, spoken softly in an interview, became something of a mantra online. People printed it, shared it, tattooed it. The world had found power and defiance again, thanks to one woman, and a brotherhood that refused to bow. Back in the city, Holloway faced trial. His wealth couldn't save him this time. His lawyers tried to twist the story, to blame hackers, to claim extortion, but the evidence was undeniable. One by one, witnesses came forward, emboldened by Emily's courage. The courtroom fell silent the day the verdict was read, guilty on all charges. As the judge's gavel struck, Jax watched the news from the garage, arms folded, eyes hard. Ghost grinned. Justice served. But Jax only nodded. "Justice started," he said. "It doesn't end with one man." That night, the angels gathered for a final ride. Not for vengeance, not for glory, but for peace. The sky was clear, the moon full, the air alive with the promise of redemption. They rode through the sleeping city, engines growling low like lions at rest. People peeked from windows, some afraid, some in awe. They didn't wave, and the angels didn't stop. They weren't riding for recognition. They were riding for the idea that somewhere out there, Someone might sleep easier because of them. When they reached the highway, Jax took the lead, the horizon stretching open before him. The lights of the city faded behind, replaced by the quiet whisper of wind and freedom. For the first time in a long time, he felt something close to peace. The fight would never end. Corruption would always find new faces. But tonight, the road belonged to them. And as the engines thundered beneath the stars, Jax's voice broke the silence. We ride not to destroy, but to remind the world that fear changes sides eventually. The others nodded, their headlights cutting through the darkness like truth through lies. As the months rolled on, the legend of that night refused to die. It drifted through the veins of the city like smoke, whispered in hushed tones, retold in fragments, reshaped by awe and fear. People began calling the Hells Angels the silent jury, a name born from the belief that they appeared when justice failed. Newspapers tried to track them down, but they were ghosts, appearing only when the balance tipped too far toward darkness. To the powerful, they were a warning. To the powerless, they were a promise. And somewhere in the middle of that myth stood Jax, a man still wrestling with the weight of what he'd started. He spent his nights at the edge of the city, alone by the old railroad bridge, listening to the wind rush through the steel beams. The sound reminded him of the road, the one constant in a world full of lies. Ghost found him there one evening, holding 2 beers and a grin. You ever think about stopping? He asked. Jax shrugged. Stopping what? All of it, Ghost said. The rides, the fights, the noise. Jax took a long sip before answering. You stop fighting, the world forgets how to care. Ghost nodded slowly. He didn't argue. He just sat beside his brother, 2 silhouettes staring into the city lights, knowing that peace was a luxury they could never afford. Meanwhile, Holloway's trial had become a spectacle. He was sentenced to decades in prison, but it wasn't the verdict that broke him. It was the silence that followed. No one visited, no one defended him, no one remembered him as anything but a disgrace. His name, once stamped on buildings and campaigns, was now a ghost of corruption fading into oblivion. Justice had not just taken his freedom, it had taken his legacy. Jax watched the coverage without satisfaction. He'll spend the rest of his life behind bars, Cole said. Jax nodded. Yeah, but we'll spend hours on the road. Justice doesn't retire. Emily reached out one last time, sending a letter to the garage. Her handwriting was soft but steady. You didn't just save me. You reminded me that there's still good in the world. Maybe it wears leather and rides in storms, but it's good all the same. Jax folded the letter carefully, placing it in his jacket pocket. He didn't show it to anyone. Some things weren't meant for the brotherhood. They were meant for the heart. That single piece of paper became his compass on long rides, a quiet reminder of why he rode in the first place. As winter settled in, the crew slowed down. The nights grew longer, the roads emptier. But inside the garage, the hum of engines never stopped. Each bike told a story. Each scar on their hands, each dent in the metal, each roar of thunder through the streets. They weren't chasing glory. They were keeping the balance. Because somewhere, another voice was being silenced, another truth being buried. And when that happened, they would ride again. They always did. Spring came quietly, washing the city clean. The storms that had once carried their fury now whispered renewal. The angels gathered for the first ride of the season, a tradition that felt more sacred than ever. Engines growled, boots hit the asphalt, and leather jackets caught the morning light. But before they left, Cole called them together. This year, he said, we ride for something different. Not for payback, not for fear. We ride to remind people that even when the system breaks, brotherhood doesn't. His voice was steady, but his eyes glimmered with pride. They had become more than men on bikes. They had become symbols of resistance. As they rolled through the city, people no longer looked away. Some waved. Some cheered. Some simply stood in silence, hands over their hearts. The same people who once feared them now understood them. The angels hadn't changed their ways. They'd changed the meaning of them. Their reputation had evolved from chaos to code, from vengeance to virtue. They were living proof that even those branded as outlaws could become guardians when the world needed them most. Midway through the ride, Jax pulled over near the courthouse, the same place Holloway had once walked in arrogance. He removed his helmet and stared at the building for a long moment. Ghost pulled up beside him. "What's on your mind?" he asked. "Balance," Jack said. "We gave it back to one person. But look around. There's always another Holloway waiting to rise." Ghost sighed. "Then we keep riding." Jax nodded slowly. "Yeah, we keep riding." That evening, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fire and gold. The crew stopped at a diner off the highway, the same one they'd sat in the night before the confrontation months ago. The waitress recognized them and smiled. "The usual?" she asked. "Yeah," Tank said, "but add a beer for the road." Laughter rippled through the group, but it wasn't careless. It was relief, the kind that comes only after surviving storms. They were still standing, still together, still fighting in their own way. When they finally left, the sound of their engines rolled through the night like a heartbeat. The road stretched open before them, endless and alive. The world didn't need to know their names or see their faces. It only needed to feel their presence. And as the stars flickered above, Jax's voice carried through the wind. "We don't ride for glory. We ride because someone has to." The others fell in line behind him, a formation of loyalty and defiance, fading into the night like a promise carved into the roar of justice. The months that followed carried a strange calm. For the first time in years, there were no enemies to chase, no corrupt men to expose, no battles to fight. Yet peace, for the angels, felt almost unnatural, like silence after a storm. Jack spent long hours in the garage, fixing bikes that didn't need fixing, tightening bolts that were already secure. The others teased him for it, but they knew what it meant. Men like Jax didn't know how to rest. They weren't built for stillness. They were built for movement, for purpose. And though Holloway's fall had changed everything, it hadn't changed the world enough. There was still work to be done. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Cole gathered the crew. "We started something we didn't mean to," he said. "People look at us now like we're heroes. But we're not. We're just men who refuse to look away." He paused, glancing at Jax. "You gave them something the law couldn't. Hope. And now, they expect more from us." The air grew heavy. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, Jax said, "Then we give it. Not by fighting every battle, but by showing that justice doesn't need a uniform." His voice was low, but his conviction was iron. That night, they made a decision that would redefine who they were. They formed a quiet alliance, a network of veterans, riders, and everyday people who'd had enough of corruption and abuse. They called it the Roadkeepers. It wasn't a gang. It was a movement. They didn't break laws. They protected the broken. Every man who joined took an oath. Ride for truth, stand for the voiceless, and never forget who you are beneath the leather. It spread faster than they imagined. From one city to another, riders started carrying their insignia, not as a symbol of rebellion, but of resistance rooted in integrity. Emily, now an advocate for victims' rights, joined the cause from her own corner of the world. She spoke at rallies, led fundraisers, and told her story, not of pain, but of reclamation. In one interview, she was asked what gave her courage to keep going. She smiled softly and said, "The road gave me brothers I never met, and their echo reminds me that justice doesn't die in silence. It rides." Her words reached millions, becoming a spark that lit fires across a weary nation. For Jax, those words meant more than she could ever know. Late one night, he stood alone on an empty highway, wind howling around him, the horizon stretching into darkness. He took out her letter, the same one he had carried for months, and read it again. The ink had faded, but the message burned as bright as ever. "You reminded me that there's still good in the world." He folded it carefully, tucked it back in his jacket, and whispered, "And you reminded me why we never stop." The engine roared to life, and once again, the night carried his promise forward. Years passed, but the legend never faded. The Hells Angels were no longer just a story told in smoke-filled bars or whispered in fear. They had become a myth of moral reckoning, the embodiment of the idea that truth cannot be silenced forever. The world changed around them. Laws shifted, systems reformed, and countless lives were touched by their actions. Yet the angels themselves remained what they had always been, riders bound not by glory, but by purpose. And though their faces aged and their hands grew rougher, their spirits never dimmed. One crisp autumn evening, Jax and Cole rode to the edge of the city one last time. The skyline glittered ahead of them, alive yet distant. "You ever think we did enough?" Cole asked quietly. Jax smiled faintly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Enough," he said. "No, but maybe that's the point. The road's not about finishing. It's about keeping the fire alive." They sat in silence for a while, the wind tugging at their jackets, the engines ticking softly beneath them. The world had moved on, but the road still belonged to those who dared to chase meaning through its endless miles. Down below, a mural covered an old brick wall, a painting of motorcycles beneath storm clouds, with the words, "No voice stays buried forever." It had been painted by a group of survivors who credited the angels for their courage. When Jack saw it, he smiled, a quiet, almost invisible kind of pride. "We never asked for a legacy," he said. Cole nodded. "But we left one anyway." The engines growled softly, like thunder remembering where it came from. As night fell, the two men turned back toward the open highway. The stars began to pierce through the clouds, one by one, until the sky itself seemed to light their way. They didn't know where the next road would lead, and that was fine. Men like them never needed directions, only purpose. And their purpose, forged in fire and loyalty, was far from over. When dawn finally broke, the sound of their bikes faded into the horizon. The city behind them returned to its noise, its chaos, its fragile balance. But somewhere, in the hum of the wind and the echo of distant engines, you could still hear it. The unspoken vow of those who refused to let power drown truth. They weren't angels of heaven or demons of hell. They were men of the road, guardians of what was right in a world that had forgotten how to care. And as long as one injustice remained unchallenged, the roar of justice would never fall silent. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, bathed in the golden light of dawn, a road that carried not just wheels, but the weight of everything they had stood for. The roar of engines faded into a hum, as if the earth itself was taking a breath after years of unrest. The Hells Angels had never sought glory, but somewhere along that road, they had become something larger than men, symbols of courage in a world that had forgotten what real justice looked like. They had proven that power doesn't belong to the loudest voice, but to the one brave enough to speak when silence is demanded. And in their silence, they had made the whole world listen. Jax looked out at the horizon, wind cutting through his hair, the reflection of 1,000 memories burning behind his eyes. He had seen men fall and rise, watched truth be buried and reborn, and learned that redemption doesn't come from revenge. It comes from the courage to act when no one else will. "We weren't heroes," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "We were reminders." The others nodded in quiet understanding. They didn't need monuments or medals. Their legacy lived on every time someone found the strength to stand up and say enough. The world would keep spinning. More Holloways would rise, men drunk on greed, power, and control. But so would voices like Emily's, born from the ashes of fear into defiance. And maybe there was the lesson buried beneath the roar of engines and the shadow of leather jackets. Evil wins when good men stay quiet, but the moment even one person dares to fight back, the tide turns. Sometimes it takes outlaws to remind society what decency truly means. Sometimes the justice that changes the world doesn't wear a badge. It rides on two wheels through the night. As the sun climbed higher, Cole turned to Jax and said, "Think they'll remember us?" Jax smiled faintly. "They already do. Not by name, but by what we stood for." He revved his engine once, the sound deep and steady, like a heartbeat echoing across time. The others followed, engines roaring to life, a final symphony of thunder and steel. They rode toward the horizon not to escape the world, but to leave a mark upon it, a trail of truth, loyalty, and unbroken will. And as their silhouettes disappeared into the light, a voice, calm, strong, and steady, broke the silence. If this story moved you, let it remind you that real courage starts when you refuse to look away. Leave your thoughts below, share what justice means to you, and join this road of truth by subscribing. Because out there, in every injustice, the world is waiting for someone brave enough to rise. The screen faded to black, but the echo of engines and the promise of what they stood for refused to die.